We're going to spend time in 2 Samuel, and the context for this message is about parenting. So if you're not a parent or you feel like, well, what could I learn from this? There are plenty of things to learn, and I think a lot of times the influence we have on people is very parent-like, even if we're not currently in that role. But I think one thing about parenting that's unique about it, it's very unique in the way that it can explain just the way that life works, I think, and just how we're influenced by people. But as a parent, I think parenting is such a tremendous blessing, but it's also a tremendous responsibility that each parent feels. Now, it's chock full of things that can make us swell with pride at the same time as worrying with fear about our kids, or even feel disappointed at times. Now, I have yet to meet a parent who doesn't want a good or better life for their kids than what they had growing up. And even a parent with maybe unrealistic expectations, or parents that seem consumed with their child making it in sports or academics or whatever their choice is, long after their kids have long just stopped showing any kind of interest, even those parents are at least partially motivated by the intention of wanting their kids to succeed at the same level or even more so than they have. Now, I think most parents understand the difficulty in balancing wanting to do things right themselves and the responsibility of teaching their kids things such as discipline, commitment, a good work ethic, and even how not to be a jerk. And at times, we have to keep teaching our kids in the same way that we have to keep learning that lesson at times. I think, though, if you are a parent, you know you haven't done everything right, but you continually do your best. You can learn from mistakes that you've made in the past, but you can keep moving forward because you don't just stop being a parent because something didn't go right. Parenting, I think, is tough, but it's fun. And it's a paradox living in tension between being too hard on ourselves and not taking it seriously enough while enjoying it along the way. Some parents, and maybe I don't want to project on anybody else, I, as a parent, have had to be reminded at times, have fun. Have fun in the moments. One of the realities of being a parent, I think, is that your behavior will help shape and mold your children. It'll help and shape your children's attitudes, your children's values, their actions, for better or for worse. And it's interesting because I recently heard this quote from the all-time best basketball player, and he said, "When I was younger, I didn't have a dad. So my whole deal was, when I have a kid, not only is he going to be a junior, but I'm going to do everything that this man didn't do. They're going to experience things I didn't experience. The only thing I can do is give them the blueprint, and it's up to them to take their own course whenever that time comes." I feel like a lot of people operate in that sphere. And I think what that quote demonstrates is that it's just as parents have to worry about the patterns or the blueprints that we lay for our kids, it is also up to our kids to either be nothing like the parents that they have or to follow in their footsteps. They have to make those decisions. All you can do is teach, right? And so as we continue our series in King David today, we'll be in 2 Samuel chapter 8, and what we'll find is King David and his son Absalom. And it's a powerful lesson about parenting and really influence we have on those that are learning from us. But in the context of David, King David, it's about his son Absalom. And what we find in this story is this truth, that good parenting teaches lessons while great parenting lives them out. Or to put it another way, good parenting teaches lessons, great parenting demonstrates them. Just to catch up to where we are when we get to 2 Samuel 18, is King David was the second king of God's people of Israel, and the nation of Israel. And about 1,000 years before Jesus, Israel is a very prosperous nation under the rule of King David. And the country is all united. All the tribes are united behind King David. Now, last week, Jamie did a really great message talking about when David was at the height of his power, at the very height of his power, he fathered a child with his neighbor Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Now David instructs his commander, Joab, to move Uriah to the front of the battle so that Uriah would be killed. Then David could marry Uriah's wife, and the child's legitimacy could be covered up with the whole thing. In hearing about Uriah's death, David goes even as far to tell Joab, the sword devours this one today and that one tomorrow. Sorry, I'm one slide behind. Yeah, the sword devours this one today and that one tomorrow. It's kind of like he's like, well, that's life. Not very compassionate about someone that he moved to the front of the lines. And so David is confronted by God's spokesman, the prophet Nathan, in chapter 12. David is told that his family will live by the sword and that his family will rebel against him. And so that's kind of given in the context of chapter 12. Now, between chapter 12 and chapter 18, there's a lot of stuff that happens, a lot that transpires in the life and the family of David. But let me oversimplify it for you for time's sake. David's son Amnon rapes his half-sister Tamar, who is the sister of Absalom. Absalom, understandably, seeing his sister raped, becomes enraged. The thing is, though, is David does not punish Amnon because he says, I love him. I can't punish him. So Absalom takes justice into his own hands and he kills Amnon. David grieves. Absalom flees the kingdom, runs away because he's afraid of what's going to happen because he just killed his half-brother. And what happens over time is, if you read that, is that David kind of half-heartedly offers forgiveness to Absalom. He lets him come back into Jerusalem, but he says, you can't come into my house. So it's kind of like he's like, yeah, you can come back, but I don't want to see you. I don't want to talk to you. I don't want any of that stuff. He says, you can't even come in my presence. And so Absalom is a little disgruntled. He starts talking to other people, kind of saying, you know what? King David isn't a very good king. And he keeps talking about the idea of like, well, if I were king, here's how I'd do things. And so Absalom is kind of on this thing where he's just kind of sowing seeds of discord, and he plots to become king. And so what happens is David flees. So that's where we kind of find ourselves in chapter 18. It is the context of this family drama. Jamie talked last week about soap operas, and I feel like if this isn't like Days of Our Lives or The Young and the Restless, I don't know what is, because it's a lot of just drama going on and a lot of tension and different things going on. But that's where we find ourselves. And as Nathan had predicted or prophesied about, David's family in front of his very eyes has rebelled against him and is living by the sword. And here's what we see in verse 5. And it says, and the king gave this command to Joab, Abishai, and Ittai. For my sake, deal gently with young Absalom. And all the troops heard the king give this order to his commanders. And so what we see here, I think, even in reading that, is you have David as king, but David is also a father. And so the king gives an order, but he also has the love of the father kind of giving something on the side. There's a tension here out of acting out of duty as a king in tension with the love and the mercy of a father. Now maybe you can relate as a parent or someone who had parents that there is sometimes a struggle with what is needed to be done and what our hearts tell us we want to do instead. Any of us who have ever been kids can relate to often hope for our parents to remember their love, and it will lead them to somehow like not do what we think they should, or at least what they think they should do. Now, for those of us that are like me that grew up in the dark ages, you'll remember the mini speech you always got. This will hurt me more than what? It'll hurt you. Like, really? Are you sure about that? But anyway, and I think when we heard that speech, or at least when I heard that speech, I always would hope that maybe, just maybe, the love would lead them to a pardon more than to the belt. But I wasn't a very good kid. So I'll just leave it at that. But the reality of there was that tension there where you kind of hope for that. But how many times as we interact with people do we remember that they are in fact someone's daughter or someone's son? Like here, that's what David's asking. He's saying, hey, as you deal with my family, please remember that they are my son. How many times as we go through our lives, as we encounter people at a restaurant, at a gas station, at a grocery store, cutting us off on the freeway, do we remember that is someone's son or someone's daughter? Now, some of us say, hey, why didn't your parents teach you better? But that's not really what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the idea that you could hear their parents say, deal gently with them. That's my son or that's my daughter. What if right before we reacted to someone, we would hear that? For my sake, deal gently with them. We continue in the passage then. It says, so the battle began in the forest of Ephraim, and the Israelite troops were beaten back by David's men. There was a great slaughter that day, and 20,000 men laid down their lives. The battle raged all across the countryside, and more men died because of the forest than were killed by the sword. During the battle, Absalom happened to come upon some of David's men. He tried to escape on his mule, but as he rode beneath the thick branches of a giant tree, where did I go? Absalom happened to come upon some of David's men. He tried to escape on his mule, but as he rode beneath the thick branches of a giant tree, his hair got caught in the tree. His mule kept going, and it left him dangling in the air. Now, if there's never been a better passage to say why bald is better than having long hair, I think it might be this passage. Aside from the fact that if you're bald and someone makes fun of you, the bears might come out and maul you. Anyway, that aside, this is just kind of a crazy happening, isn't it? Like, he's riding his mule, which is interesting enough, and he gets caught, and he's hanging in the air by his hair. Absalom is dangling there in the air. The NASB, the North American Standard Bible, says he is left hanging between heaven and earth. And that's really what's going on here, is that he's hanging in the balance. His life is hanging in the balance. Absalom is left completely vulnerable. And I'm wondering if in his mind in those moments he's thinking, how in the world did I get here? I mean, I don't mean just hanging in the branches, but just in general, like how in the world have I gotten so far removed from the palace and from the life I was living that now I'm sitting here in the midst of a battle with my father? How did my plan go awry? It seems so perfect. And maybe you can relate to that. There have been times in your life when you had a plan for how things were going to go, and you get to a certain step, and you're saying, wait a second, how in the world did this plan get so messed up? How did something, I trust you've never gotten caught in a tree by your hair, but there have probably been times when you've looked up and been like, what in the world is going on? I believe it had to be a sobering moment for Absalom. I assume Absalom thought he was going to have victory, and instead, he's dangling there. Now, Absalom had grown up under the parenting of a king who had demonstrated with Uriah and Bathsheba that he would take what he wanted, that he would allow the sword to be the method to achieve his goals. He would not show remorse, but instead, as we quoted earlier, he would say, the sword devours this one today and another one tomorrow. Absalom is not just living out a prophecy, he is living out a lifestyle he saw his dad live out. And that's tough. Regardless of the stories that Absalom had been told, I'm sure he was told all about King David on his way to becoming a king, all the stories about what he did as a shepherd, what he did against Goliath, what he did, all these different things while he waited for God to make him king. Even his early days as king, he had heard all of those stories. What Absalom saw was more powerful than the stories of the past, and it seems to have stuck with him and informed his views and ultimately his actions. And so it is his actions that have led him here. Commentator Walter Brueggemann says, Absalom is suspended between life and death, between the sentence of a rebel and the value of a son, between the severity of the king and the yearning of a father. We can guess that David would not echo to Joab what he had said to Uriah back then. But David isn't even there. What we read in the next verse is this: then 10 of Joab's young armor bearers then surrounded Absalom and killed him. Regardless of what David was struggling with, we don't sense any struggle from Joab and his men. Continues, then the man from Ethiopia arrived and said, I have good news for my lord the king. Today the Lord has rescued you from all those who rebelled against you. What about young Absalom? The king demanded. Is he all right? And the Ethiopian replied, May all of your enemies, my lord the king, both now and in the future, share the fate of that young man." The king was overcome with emotion. He went up to the room over the gateway and burst into tears. And as he went, he cried, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." Despite the victory in the situation, David doesn't celebrate. Instead, what we see is a parent, is a father that is completely rocked to his core at the death of his son. Now, we've seen King David grieve before. When King Saul was killed, there was grieving, but this time there's no eloquent words from David. There's no song to be sung about how great his son was. With Saul, David could easily think of what a pity it was that Saul turned out the way he did and said, like, what a pity, it could have been so much. But with Absalom, David doesn't have the luxury to say, "Oh, that could have been so much," because it was David's life that taught Absalom the way to live. It wasn't the media. It wasn't politicians and their policies. It wasn't violence on TV or, Absalom hadn't spent too much time playing violent video games. It was none of those things. No, it was David who had the responsibility of raising his son, and it was David who demonstrated a life that Absalom learned to live, regardless of the lessons that David had intended. David's sins, not his sons, David's sins were transferred to his son as the pattern continued, and his son suffers a tragic end. Now, I think it's important to mention that Absalom isn't simply just a victim as he chose to live by what he was taught by his father. Now, he could have overcome a difficult upbringing. Many people have. He could have been like that quote from LeBron, promising to do things differently than what he learned from a father or an absent father. He could have been like that, but he didn't. I think there's a quote by a fellow Nazarene pastor named Danny Quanstrom. He draws an interesting contrast between David, who had so mishandled the raising and especially the forgiving of his son, contrasting that picture with the picture of Jesus' parable in the prodigal son. In that story, the son takes his inheritance. You'll remember if you've heard that story. He takes his inheritance, he squanders it, and he returns home to his father, similar to the way that Absalom had tried to take his kingship early, and he squandered his inheritance on a rebellion. And when both return home, the contrast is very stark and very clear in these two things. Here's what we see. The compassionate father runs out to his son. He's looking for him. David, on the other hand, sends Joab to bring Absalom home to Jerusalem. The compassionate father opens his home. David doesn't even let his son in his presence for 2 years, let alone into his home. The compassionate father lavishes love on his returned son. David begrudgingly permits Absalom back in the kingdom. And so we can't excuse the actions of the prodigal, and we can't just excuse the actions of Absalom. But we can understand both of their eagerness, and we can understand the way that David reacts. Could you blame him? I feel like when we hear the story of Absalom, it's, you killed my son. Could you blame him for not wanting to be in his presence? No. But we're left with a celebration and a party with the prodigal son, but we're left with a life gone and the grief of the father because of Absalom. Actually, 2 lives that are gone. And I think it's through that whole story that we see this truth come out that we already mentioned. It's good parenting teaches lessons, but great parenting lives them out. And I think we have to collectively pause and understand that great parenting is great first and foremost in its impact or imprint regardless of its goodness. Bad life habits and good life habits always trump a lesson, don't they? Like if you sit and tell someone something, but then they see the way you live, the disconnect is going to be like, they don't really believe that. just last night. My daughter went to eat something, and I said, do you think you should be eating this late? And she said, well, I didn't have dinner. And I said, okay, whatever. So she ate. And then later I went and got a little something, and she said, Dad, do you think you should be eating this late? And I said, funny you should mention that. I'm preaching about that tomorrow. She's like, well, there's an example for you. So if you see Evie, tell her that I used her example. But I try to explain it away with adults are different than kids, but it didn't really work. But that's really what it shows, is your habits and the things you do give testimony to the lessons that you teach, or they take it away. We see that with the church, both in children and adults. And now the number one reason researchers say that young people are leaving the church who were raised in church beyond high school is because they never saw the impact or make a difference in the way that their parents lived their life outside of church. They just never saw it and said, okay, you say this, you sing about this, you profess this, but then when I look at your life, I don't see any difference in how you live compared to my neighbor. Now, some of you might remember there used to be these little stores, and they would develop film in 24 hours. And then we remember these places where you drop off your film and they deliver it. Yeah, a few of you, right? And it was a big deal when it came out because you used to have to wait a long time for your film. But now they can be developed in like 24 hours. That was a huge deal. Over time, there became places that could do it in half a day. Then there was like 2 hours and eventually 1 hour. But it was kind of a cool concept. Unfortunately, I think in the church, many of us have treated church like we would that photo center. We take our kids to church and we hope to get them back after an hour or two as fully developed Christians. We're saying, hey, they're there. Why don't they know more about Jesus? But the reality of it is extremely difficult for an hour a week of church to undo the lessons that are lived in front of kids the other 167 hours. And if we are to be honest with ourselves, which I think church is a good place to be honest with ourselves, we adults are often not so much different. Ask us our thoughts about this thing or that thing, and rarely do we hear a Christian value or a Christian view. And I believe one of the reasons is because we might give God an hour or 2 hours a week to impact our lives, maybe even 2 to 4 hours if we read a devotional in the morning, but we give televised broadcasts and online news the majority of our waking hours, allowing them to speak into our lives and frame our thinking. So typically what comes out isn't a value or thought through the lens of Jesus Christ, but it's typically one formed by what we've been given the most prominent voice to in our lives. And so when people say, well, I don't understand why I haven't been further along in my Christian faith, that's if people will say that, and I trust all you people do, it's just the people at other churches, they say that, I've heard about them, and they're just like so confused. Meanwhile, what they give their time and their mind and their understanding and their view is formed by something else. Ask people what they think about most things, and it's something that they'll repeat that they've heard or be given from someone else. And it's generally not the Bible. And I got to move on because otherwise I'll get in trouble. But I think that's why the church loses its voice. Is because the culture speaks continuously and constantly with a different message. And we give our time and attention to that longer than we do God. And that ultimately is why our Christian values aren't carried on by our children. Because despite what we have said we believe, we have lived a life that says something else. The bottom line is, good parenting teaches lessons. Great parenting lives them out. And so I want to say parents, future parents, aunts, uncles, grandparents, and influencers, spiritual parents, I don't know how you've been living. I don't know what you've been teaching. I don't know how you've been parenting or mentoring, but I do know this. It is never too late to make the next step the right step. To take that first step in the right direction. You might not have the resources of a LeBron James, but you can make a decision today that can change what is written about the legacy of your life. Not only about your life, but about your parenting and through the lives of your children and those you have influence with, and also your children's children. Because you and I have a Father who is always waiting for us. If we will simply stop heading in our own direction and turn towards Him, Jesus is better than David. Jesus is the fulfillment of what King David was supposed to become. And Jesus is the prodigal father who runs out in mercy and grace and says, it doesn't matter where you've been, it doesn't matter what you've done, but if you turn towards me, welcome home, let's have a party. And that's the truth of what Jesus offers. He forgives, He reconciles, He welcomes, He restores, He makes us sons and daughters and reestablishes us. If you think of the story where the older brother says, it's like, what's going on? And he said, I had a son that was dead, but now he's alive again. And so do you see the difference between that and David? The great thing about God is He doesn't only give us His written word, but He has given us the living word to not just live out the perfect example, but to forgive us of our sins, to unlock the ability to live differently. And so no matter what you will face this week or the week after that, the tomb is empty. And so you can have the faith to say that it doesn't matter what I experience this week, it doesn't shatter my hope on the rocks of life. Instead, I still have hope that this is not the end of the story. This might just be part of it. There's a Chinese proverb that says, I can't turn the slide. It doesn't say that. They didn't have slides, at least how old this is. It says, the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The second best time is now. Don't get caught up in what you haven't done to this point. Don't get caught up in what you've messed up to this point. Instead, focus on what you can do today. Unless you have a time machine or a DeLorean and a Doc Brown, unless you have those options to you, now is the best time to take that first step in the right direction in life, in Christ, in parenting, and everywhere. So many times we think we have to clean ourselves up, but that's not what we have to do. It's not about us cleaning ourselves up. It's about Jesus meets you where you are, and He will do the cleaning. He will do the changing. He will change you from the inside out. And so that's what we have. That's the options we have. And I don't know if you've met people like this, but I've met so many people that are so just tied up in what they did. They'll say, well, here's how I messed this up. Here's how I did this other thing. And they can't forgive themselves. The good news is Jesus can forgive you. And if you come to Him, He'll say, you're forgiven. And if He forgives you, then you can forgive yourself. And you can move on into that and say, I can't do anything about what happened. I can only do about what is going to happen. I can only find out by going forward. I can only take that step now. And so whether you're a parent, whether you're not a parent, whether it's a parent, you always have an option to move and learn in the right direction from now on through Jesus Christ. Will you stand with me? Let's pray.